Welcome to session 324 of the Bible in a Year commentary. If you started this series on the 1st of January, then today should be the 20th of November. Today we'll be looking at 1 Thessalonians 3-5 and Psalm 14. But so far in 1 Thessalonians, we've read as Paul praised the Thessalonians for their faithfulness and encouraged them that the gospel he brought was genuine. After briefly visiting Thessalonica and facing persecution, Paul moved on but sent Timothy back to encourage the believers there. Timothy later reported that despite persecution, the Thessalonians were growing in their faith. Paul then wrote this letter to praise and encourage their perseverance. Paul opened with gratitude for their faith, love, and hope, noting how they had become an example to believers across Macedonia and Greece. He reminded them of his time in Thessalonica. He emphasized his genuine motives and care, working night and day to avoid being a burden. The Thessalonians' acceptance of the gospel demonstrated that it was from God, not human teaching. Paul praised their endurance in suffering and expressed his desire to see them again, rejoicing in their steadfastness as a testament to his ministry. But let's jump into today's reading, 1 Thessalonians 3-5. After Paul left Thessalonica, he was desperate to know how the small church was getting on. He and the team sent Timothy back to Thessalonica to check in on them and encourage them in their faith despite persecution. Paul's own ministry was evidence that persecution would continue, and it was something that Paul had warned them of when he was with them. So Timothy went and then came back with the good report on how the Thessalonians were doing. Because of this, while Paul had been going through more difficulties and persecutions, he was able to rejoice in the flourishing of the Thessalonians. Paul is so grateful for the faithfulness of this church and continues to pray that he might one day go back to them to continue to support them and teach them. He prays that the Thessalonians will continue to grow in love and that God continues to strengthen their hearts so they continue to be homely and blameless. This leads Paul into the second half of the letter, focused on encouraging the Thessalonians in how they should live. He urges them to live in a way that pleases God. Paul reminds them of the teaching he gave them when he was with them. They must have mastery of their bodies and its lusts, not giving themselves over to sexual immorality. That's what those who don't know God do. They're called to something different. Particularly, they are to make sure they do no wrong or take advantage of one another sexually. This is because the Lord is an avenger. 1 Thessalonians 4:6. He will punish this sort of abuse. Paul warns them that they have been called to holiness, not impurity. If anyone claims that this is not an issue and that they're just free to do what they want, then they should know that they're not resisting some commands from Paul. This is the call of God, who is in them through the Holy Spirit. Outside of sexuality, the Thessalonians should live their lives ordered by love. Paul acknowledges they already do this and are well known for it, but encourages them to do so even more. Their ambition should be to live a quiet life in a way that sets a good example. He encourages them to mind their own affairs and work with their own hands. This seems like it was because some of the Thessalonians refused to work. This might have been because now part of the church they knew that others would support them out of generosity, or because they believed Jesus would come back any day now, and so why waste time on mundane things like work? The problem with this is that they weren't able to support themselves and were being a drain on their community. Paul's encouragement is that they work hard so they might have a good reputation with those outside the church and not be dependent on others for support. If it was because the Thessalonians believed Jesus was coming back soon, Paul moves to address that topic. It also seems like some of them had died, and so the Thessalonians were distressed about that. Paul encourages them, letting them know that they are not like those who have no hope. Just as Jesus died and rose again, God will restore those who have died with Jesus. When Jesus returns, it is those who died who will be with him first. We then get a description of Jesus' return, that with a shout and a trumpet sound, he will descend from heaven, and those who die will rise up to join him. Then those who are still alive will also join him in the clouds. This passage, along with Matthew 24, verses 40-41, is often used to point to the rapture, the idea that God will whisk away all believers into heaven and leave behind the unbelievers. But when we looked at Matthew 24, verses 40-41, we pointed out that it was more talking about God weeding out unbelievers and removing them rather than the other way round. Here in 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 16-17, Paul is drawing on the Old Testament imagery of the day of the Lord, when God will come and bring judgment and make all things right. See Isaiah 27, verse 13, Joel 2, verse 1, Zephaniah 1, verse 14-16, and Zechariah 9, verse 14 for some examples. The fact that believers are going to be caught up in the clouds is a reference to Daniel 7:13, where the Son of Man comes on the clouds. Daniel 7 verses 21-22 and verse 27 mention holy ones who joined the Son of Man and with him took authority over the kingdom. 1 Thessalonians 4 verses 16-17 isn't about Jesus returning and whisking believers off into the sky. It's about Jesus returning with authority and the believers joining him in that authority to see the earth redeemed and finally brought under God's authority once again. The hope that Paul is giving these Thessalonians who are worried about those they care for who have died is that one day Jesus will return to restore the whole world to himself. When he does that, both the dead and the living will be restored and come together with Jesus. They will one day see their loved ones again, which then naturally raises the question, when will this happen? Paul explains there is nothing to tell them because the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night when they're not expecting it. Note how Paul specifically calls this event the Day of the Lord, linking it into that Old Testament tradition. He also echoed the words of Jesus in Matthew 24 verse 43, where Jesus is saying the same thing. There will be some that assume that everything is fine, and then like labour pains, Jesus will return and judgment will come before the restoration properly starts. Paul encourages the Thessalonians that they are not thieves or those who sleep in the dark. They have been moved from darkness into light with eyes wide open. Because of this, they should keep their eyes open, always being ready, knowing that Jesus will one day return. They should put on the breastplate of faith and love and the helmet of salvation. Here we can see early ideas of Paul's armour of God that he unpacked in Ephesians 6 verses 13 to 17. As 1 Thessalonians is early in Paul's career, he clearly develops this concept more as his ministry continues. As believers, the Thessalonians won't experience the judgment of the day of the Lord because Jesus died for them. This includes those who are alive and those who died. Therefore, they should encourage and support one another and be ready for that day. Finally, Paul ends with some last encouragements. The Thessalonians should respect their spiritual leaders who work hard for their benefit. They should seek to be at peace with one another. This involves dealing with different people in different ways. Those who are idle need challenging. Those who are faint-hearted need encouraging. Those who are weak need help. And they all need a great deal of patience. They shouldn't lash out at those who hurt them or seek revenge. Instead, they should always seek to do good. In all things, they should look to rejoice, pray, and give thanks. And when it comes to the prophetic, they should not quench this spiritual gift or ignore it, but at the same time, they should always test it and weigh it up, holding fast to what is good and doing away with whatever is not. And then Paul ends with a final prayer for them and closing greetings. Because 1 Thessalonians is such an early letter, it has what we call the least developed theology. Paul is still working out a lot of things, and so we don't have as many of the more worked out ideas and images that we found in Romans or 1 Corinthians or Galatians or Ephesians. What we do have is a letter from a pastor who cares deeply for one of the first churches that he planted. He wants to encourage them in their persecution and guide them to continue living right, and then give them hope that one day it will all be worth it. But that is the first letter to the Thessalonians. Now let's look at Psalm 14. This psalm is attributed to King David and is often considered a lament psalm, but it's not that clear. We've established before that the common beats of a lament psalm are turning to God, bringing the complaint before God, making a request of God, and then declaring trust in God. But this psalm has less of the feel of someone bringing their complaints to God and asking him to intervene, and more the feel of someone who is teaching on the nature of a fallen earth. There are fools who are corrupt, and those with understanding who seek after God. We have similar language in the book of Proverbs, and so it may be that this psalm is a wisdom psalm. These psalms seek to educate and teach the reader. The psalm has a duplicate later on, Psalm 53, which is almost identical with some slight variations. The psalm can be broadly broken into two parts: wisdom's lament and looking forward to deliverance. But the first part can be broken down even further. Here's a summary of the structure, but I would recommend checking out the written version of this commentary in the description to see the structure properly for yourself. We start with verse 1, the foolish. Verses 2 to 3, are there any who are wise? Spoiler, no. Verse 4, why do the wicked attack? Verses 5 to 6, God is refuge to the poor, and then verse 7, the future hope of Zion. The psalm opens on the problem that foolish, corrupt people exist, and there seems to be a lot of them. These foolish people do not believe in God, and they do wicked things. In response, God searches the earth for those who aren't foolish, those who have understanding and who seek God. But all of them have allowed themselves to become foolish. This is hyperbole, over-exaggeration, as we see there are still those who are innocent and righteous. Turning back to the foolish, the psalmist notes how they oppress and consume my people. Who is the person talking? As the psalmist is attributed to King David, then it could be from the point of the king. But it's perhaps more likely that the psalmist is talking from the point of Lady Wisdom. Lady Wisdom is a character that appears in a lot of wisdom literature who is the embodiment of wisdom. Her people are those who seek after and live by wisdom. Lady Wisdom condemns the wicked. They will be terrorized because God is the God of the righteous. As much as they might try to shame the poor, God will still protect them. And so Lady Wisdom looks forward to the day where there will be no more wicked, where God restores the good fortunes to his people. This will be a day of celebration. Thanks for joining us today. Take a moment to reflect on what you've read and share your thoughts or questions below. If you're watching in the future, then you can click here for the next session, or you can find the full playlist just down here. To receive these daily commentaries in your email inbox, subscribe via the link in the description below. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.